All right, so first thing, let's rewrite this as y equals x times, again, I'm not using s's because my s's look like 5s. So I'll know that when I check my answer in the back, it's going to have s's, but I'm using x's instead. So basically, I'm letting s equal x in my problem. I'm going to call this 1 minus x squared to the half power instead of using the radical symbol. Inverse cosine, there is no formula for derivative inverse cosine on our formula sheet. But there is a formula that you convert inverse cosine and inverse sine. Inverse cosine of x is equal to pi halves minus inverse sine of x. Like that. So that's just using an identity of your formula sheet. It's actually in the box labeled D on your formula sheet. All right, now we go through and do the derivative. Let's start with this term right here. I see multiplication and I see variable expression to the left and to the right. So what rule am I going to have to use? Product rule. Product rule says you take your first expression, which is x, times the derivative of your second expression. So your second expression is this 1 minus x squared to the half. To do that derivative, I have an outside half power. I have an inside expression of 1 minus x squared. What rule am I going to need right there? That's the chain rule. Chain rule says you multiply by half out front, take that exponent down to negative a half, copy down what's inside, 1 minus x squared, then multiply by the derivative of the inside expression, which would be negative 2x. That's the first half of the product rule, with the chain rule included. Plus, now you take your second expression, which is 1 minus x squared to the half, times the derivative of x, which is 1. So that whole thing is the derivative of what's in this rectangle up here. And I did first expression times the derivative of the second, plus the second expression times the derivative of the first. Any questions about that part? Basically, I'm letting this be u and this be v. And then what I did is I went through and did u times v prime, which is all the way to here, plus v times u prime. So that's the product rule. U times v prime plus v times u prime. Just leave it right here if you want. Okay, next, derivative of pi halves. Pi halves, that's 3.14159 divided by 2, so that's about 1.57. What's the derivative of that? 0. That's a constant. Derivative is going to be 0. Inverse sine. Make sure you don't forget this minus sign here. Inverse sine formula says the derivative of inverse sine is 1 over square root of 1 minus u squared. Now u, in this case, over here u is x. I guess in this case it would be also. Your u is whatever is right next to the inverse sine. This is my u. Okay. So it's going to be x squared times the derivative of x, which would be 1. Any questions on that? That's just straight from your formula sheet. Now we're going to start trying to simplify. This is the derivative, but now we have to simplify, try to match this back to the book. So, first of all, this is all multiplied together right here. This is all one term. So if you take a half times 2, those are going to cancel. You're going to have this left. X times negative x, which is negative x squared. I'm going to move this 1 minus x squared to the negative a half. Move that to the bottom, which would make the exponent positive a half. Any questions about that? Okay. Plus, I've got this, 1 minus x squared to the half. So you can see that negative. There was a negative here. I moved it to the bottom to make it positive. This is already positive, so I'll just leave it on the top. This is going to be minus 1 over, I'm going to call this 1 minus x squared to the half, instead of having a instead of having a square root. The reason I'm doing that, I want it to match this denominator. Now, I can only add and subtract fractions if I have a common denominator, right? So, I've already got a common denominator here and here, but what I need is to have that same denominator here. I need to have 1 minus x squared to the half here. But if I'm going to multiply by that on the bottom, I need to also multiply by that same thing up here. Right? That's a rule of fractions. Whatever you multiply the bottom by, you have to multiply the top by. So that leaves us with our last step here, dy over dx. I've got my common denominator, so I can combine all these into one fraction. I'm going to have negative x squared plus, what do I get when I multiply 1 minus x squared to the half times 1 minus x squared to the half? Yeah. Remember when you multiply, you add exponents. Half plus a half is 1. So this comes out to 1 minus x squared to the first, or just 1 minus x squared. And then you have this minus 1 over here. Now this is positive 1, this is minus 1, those would cancel. So your final answer is going to be negative x squared plus negative x squared. That would be negative 2x squared over 1 minus x squared to the half. And in the back of the book, you'll see it this way. Instead of an x, they'll change it back to s. So negative 2s squared. Instead of a half, they'll probably have a square root down here. Square root of 1 minus x. So s again. Square root of 1 minus s squared. That's what you see in the back. Any questions on that one? Lots of good stuff. Product rule, chain rule, inverse trig, simplifying fractions, all in